Alright, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. I've been going through a series of video presentations and I believe I just finished the 100th for this class, which is a record I believe for me before a class has even begun. But these presentations are part of the Rankin Technical College Application and Web Development, or AWD1111.NET Framework with Web Databases class. The main textbook for the class is scheduled to be ASP.NET MVC with Entity Framework and CSS by Lee Naylor that you see on the screen right now. However, before going over that book, which is a little void of a lot of explanation, I have been going over Professional ASP.NET MVC 5 by John Galloway of Microsoft and others. So far I've gone through the first 4 chapters, getting started, controllers, views, and models, and I'm just begun, so this will be my second lecture for Chapter 5, and I believe it was around page 105 that I was on. I don't know for sure. No, that's not correct. It is 114. So I'm going to pick it up actually talking HTML helpers. In the previous lecture, more than anything else, what we talked about in there was the idea of what a form is, what an action method is, etc. Now we're going into actual HTML helpers. Now notice HTML helpers are methods you can invoke on the HTML property of a view. Remember, views are .cs HTML files. The CS part is the C#, which we add using Razor syntax. We've talked a little bit about that previously. The rest of it, the HTML hypertext markup language, that's what we're talking about now. We also have access to URL helpers and Ajax helpers. Remember, Ajax will be the subject of Chapter 8 once we get to that point. All of these helpers have the same goal: to make views easy to author. I'd even put it a different way. Quite often they will begin the process of writing code for you, or maybe write all the code for you that you need. The URL helper is also available from within the controller. Most of these helpers output HTML markup. For example, it says the begin form helper can be used to build a robust form tag for a search form, but without using lines and lines of code. So here's their example. Chances are the begin helper will output the same markup you had previously when you first implemented the search form. However, behind the scenes, the helper is coordinating with a routing engine to generate a proper URL. So the code is rather more resilient to change. So the idea is, remember this convention over configuration. You are using their conventions to make it as easy as possible for the system to hopefully realize what it is you're trying to do. Alright? The begin helper outputs both the opening form and closing form tags. As it says, it emits the opening tag during the call, and the call returns an object implementing iDisposable. We'll get into that a little bit more, I think, a little bit later. At first glance, it might seem like these helpers are taking the developer away from the metal, the low-level HTML many developers want to control. But after you work with these for a while, you realize they keep you close to the metal while remaining productive. There's always a lot of debate amongst developers when you use wizards and things like this. Are you giving up control? Are you having the software write the code for you? And as always, as you probably would think, my opinion is it depends on the situation. Alright? So you still have complete control over the HTML, but you don't have to write lines and lines and worry about the small details. As it says, these helpers do more than just give you your angle brackets. Now, let's start here with automatic encoding. Before we even do this, one of the things that you'll hear when we get into Chapter 7 and we talk about security. All right, I've got it here someplace, but I don't know where it is. But you're best off Any input you're ever getting from users, you're best off assuming that it's bad input. Now, I don't mean that the user will necessarily try to type garbage or bad things into the system, but it happens. You always want to sanitize your input. All right? So as it says there, like any good friend, an HTML helper can keep you out of trouble. Many of these that we'll use in this chapter are used to output model values. All of them will HTML encode values before rendering. Okay? So as it says, for example, you'll see the Textarea Helper, which you can use to output an HTML text area element. Well, what's big about that? Well, it takes this, that BR tag, and it changes it into this. Now, is that important? Not in the case of a BR tag. But if the system renders it like this, instead of like this, and you can find that out, what that may mean is that rather than a BR tag, you could put a JavaScript script tag in there with some possibly bad code and have it execute as opposed to having it look more like this. So this basically is the raw code. This is how it looks when you've done encoding to make it look more or less like you put the HTML entities in there. So notice how the output value is encoded. It helps you avoid cross-site scripting attacks and other types of attacks that, again, we'll discuss in Chapter 7. Making helpers do your bidding. While protecting you, helpers also give you a level of control you might need. As an example there, it says, look at another overloaded version. Okay? What you hopefully notice there as far as what's in the bold, target equal blank, in that case, basically the target equal blank says that we want to open this up in a brand new form. So in the code, as it says here, we're passing an anonymously typed object to the HTML attributes parameter of begin form. Nearly every HTML helper includes an HTML attributes. Attribute is one of its overloaded methods. All right. The helpers take the dictionary entries, etc., and use them to create the attributes. There's, for lack of better words, again, it's kind of some free sanitization that it's doing on input and outputs. It says you may find some of these attributes a bit problematic at first. Why? Because they're not probably the way you're used to doing things. So yeah, there is some learning that has to be done in here, or you could even argue there's some relearning that has to be done in here. All right. Another possible problem with this is things like with dashes. As it says, you'll see dashes with attributes at certain times. All right. They're not a valid C# property name, but the HTML helpers convert an underscore in a property to that dash. So let's look at, it says here, inside HTML helpers. Every Razor view inherits an HTML property from its base class. That property is of type system.web.mvc.html helper T, where the T is a generic parameter which is going to represent something. The class, as it says, provides a few instance methods you can invoke in a view, such as enable client validation to turn client validation on or off on a view-by-view basis. It says you know you are working with an extension method when the IntelliSense window clicks in. HTML dot, and those are the ones that are available to you. Extension methods, again, this is the author speaking, are a wonderful approach to building HTML helpers for two reasons. Extension methods in C# are available only when the namespace is in scope. All the extension methods for HTML helper live in the system.ht.web .mvc.html namespace. If you don't like the built-in extension methods, you can remove the namespace and build your own. This build your own brings the second benefit. You can build your own extension methods to replace or augment the helpers. Again, that would be the kind of thing that you would be doing as you get more and more proficient in the language. All right, so setting up the album edit form. If you need to build a view that lets a user edit album information, you might start with the following view code. So you can see what we've added in here. Put it in a using statement, all right, with html.beginForm and adding the validation summary line in here. As it says, the two helpers in this code have some additional descriptions. So let's take a look at them, starting on the bottom of page 117. We've used the begin form helper previously. The version that's shown up above with no parameters, just what this is, sends an HTTP post to the current URL. All right, so in other words, it's saying that the method will be post. The validation summary. Post is an ideal verb because we are modifying. Yeah, that makes sense. The HTML validation summary, as mentioned right there, it displays an unordered list of validation or errors in the model state dictionary. The Boolean parameter that's being used here with a value of true tells the helper to exclude property level errors. In other words, you're telling the summary to display only the errors in the model associated with the model itself and exclude any errors associated with a specific model property. They give you an example here. See this. And it says, assume you have the following code somewhere in a controller action. The first example, where you're not passing anything in for the first parameter, is a model level error because you didn't provide a key to associate the error with a specific property. The second error is associated with the title property because that's what you passed in as the first parameter. By convention, as mentioned here near the bottom of page 118, the validation summary renders the CSS class validation-summary-errors along with any specific CSS classes you provide. All right. Adding inputs, starting on the bottom of page 118. After you have the form and validation summary in place, you can add some inputs for the user to enter album information into the view. One approach would be to use the scaffold edit view, which we used in Chapter 4. You'd end up with something similar to what's shown here and going on to the next page. We've seen this before. Here the input helpers are being highlighted, so you can see there's a validation summary, a hidden for, a label for, and there are several of them as we peruse our way through here. As a reminder, it says these helpers give the display that's shown in figure 5-4, which takes up the majority of page 120. The following new helpers are in this view, the ones I mentioned to you. Well, I guess a couple of them. Label for, drop-down list, and validation message for, along with validation summary and hidden for. It says we will talk about these and more in this section. To begin with, we'll start with the simplest, which is the Textbox Helper. Now, with a lot of these, we won't have to spend much time going over them because, as the name says, HTML.textbox and HTML.textarea. The Textbox Helper renders an input tag with a type attribute set to text. Typically, as it says, you'll use one of those for a text box, which will accept input from a user. So putting in this results in this. The Textbox Helper provides overloads that let you set individual attributes. Then there's the text box area. What's the difference? An area has a columns and a rows attribute. All right. Again, I realize I'm jumping through some of this stuff quickly. I don't know really any other way to do it. All right. The HTML.label on the bottom of page 121. The label attribute returns a label element using a string parameter to determine the rendered text and the for attribute value. Again, this is, as I've mentioned to you before, stuff that we have discussed in the AWD1111 Web Development Technologies class. The for means that there is going to be some kind of a control, a text box or something else, named genre ID, and that label is going to be identified with it. The label will say genre. If you will click on the label, once this is on the form, it will get you to the actual text box or whatever that field is. Next, as we work our way through here, we've got the drop-down list, HTML.dropdown list, and HTML.listbox. As mentioned here, both the drop-down list and the listbox helpers return a select element. The difference between these technically is really a drop-down list is kind of like a text box with a list box underneath it. All right, for lack of better words. And typically a drop-down list will only allow you to select a single item, whereas a list box, if you've got multiple item selections set up, will allow you to select multiple items. Typically, as mentioned there, a select parameter serves two purposes: to show a list of possible options and to show what you've currently selected. So, in the music store, as it says, you've got an album class with a genre property. We use the select element to display the value of the genre property. Right now, remember, it's just rock and jazz. So it shows you the one selected along with all of the possible ones. Now, they mention here you have to do a bit of setup work in the controller when using these helpers because they require specific information. A list needs a collection of select list item instances representing all the possible values. The selected list item object has the text, which is what shows on screen, the value. So a lot of times, for example, you might have on screen MO for a state where the value will actually be Missouri or vice versa. All right, and also the selected property, which is what you currently selected. You can build the collection of select list objects yourself, all right, or you can use helper classes to do it for you. So we're telling it in here, notice we're making a lambda call. So we're saying this is our input, and we want the name. Basically, we want to grab all of that information, give it in G, and do an order by. So this should be what we're doing. We're telling it basically to go look through the album's genre ID field. All right. We're looking for the name of the album, but the way that it's referenced is via genre ID. It says you can think of the controller action as building not only the primary model, but also the presentation model. If you want to avoid, they mention here, some of the overhead and generate it yourself, you can use a link query. And again, we'll talk about those in a little bit more depth and breadth of coverage later. the HTML.validation message on the middle of page 123. When an error exists for a particular field in the model state dictionary, you can use the validation message helper to display that message. Now, the example here is kind of silly. It says you purposely add an error to the model state for the title property. Well, you could check something in there, and if they did meet some criteria, you could have a customized error message print out. The message that's shown right here, this message, only appears if there is an error in the model state for the key title. And as mentioned on page 124, it says, in addition to the common features described so far, such as HTML encoding and the ability to set HTML attributes, all the form input features share a common behavior in regards to working with model values and with model state. Now I'm at 20 minutes, so I'm going to pick it up on the helper models, helpers, models, and view data, which is the next 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 or 6 pages, and then we'll get into some miscellaneous ones, some rendering helpers, and finally the URL helper, and I believe the Ajax helper as well. Alright, so we're about halfway through the chapter. This is a good place to stop, and we'll pick it up talking about helpers, models, and view data in just a couple minutes.